Yo, what's going on, boys? How you guys doing today? Welcome back to another Steam 2 video. And today, Heresy finally launched, and with it came a bunch of buffs, changes, and all those beautiful arc mods that we were waiting for. So in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the build that I was looking forward to the most on the Arc Hunter. This build is all about having some crazy damage systems, spamming abilities, making a bunch of ionic traces, jolting everything, and also now that Bolt Charge is here, just basically spamming Bolt Charge at pretty much anything that we run into. All the changes just gonna make the build even more fluid, and overall it just feels really good. So hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video, and if you do, make sure you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel in case you guys aren't already for more videos like this. And now let's get into it, and first we gotta start by talking about our exotics, because they're like the main things of the build and really what make the whole build come together. So first of all, we're gonna have the Gifted Conviction. Now the Gifted Conviction didn't really get any changes, it is basically still the same exotic, but it didn't really need anything. It essentially still gives you that crazy damage resistance whenever we jolt targets. And it doesn't have to be just with our Tempest Strike or with our Ascension, it can be any source of jolt, like the weapon that we're using today. Now for the weapon, we're gonna be using the newly buffed Delicate Tomb. This weapon is fantastic now. There's a lot of mods in the artifact that work really well with it, but also itself got some buffs, so now it makes Ionic Trace a lot more consistently. And whenever you pick up an Ionic Trace, it does more damage with its exotic perk, now doing essentially double damage, 100% more damage. And still on top of that, it's going to be jolting a bunch of targets, triggering our exotic piece of armor, meaning that we get damage resistance, and also just doing all the great things Jolt does, like adding a bit more damage, as well as some ad clear. This weapon works really well with this build, not only because it can trigger the damage resistance, so it can help us keep that up, but also because we make so many Ionic Traces with this build that we're also always proccing the exotic perk. Now, if you guys have never used this fusion rifle, this one does work a little bit differently. Whenever you hit fire it, it has like a horizontal spread, which I actually really like, because it's really good to hit a bunch of targets with the jolting shot. So whenever you have your exotic perk and there's a group of enemies, I would actually recommend that you hit fire this thing, just pretty much hitting everything. But if you aim down sights with this weapon, it essentially does become like a regular fusion rifle. So if you want it to be more accurate with this weapon, and so it doesn't do that horizontal spread, you could always just aim down sights and use it just as any other regular fusion rifle. But I definitely think that you should start using that hit fire mode, especially whenever something is really close, or just for groups of ads. It actually works really well. And the last thing that I want to say about this weapon is that I recommend that you get the Catalyst done, since the Catalyst does give you auto reloading whenever you pick up an Ionic Trace, and since we're making so many of them, you basically never have to reload the weapon normally. But even if you don't have it, it's still going to be a fantastic weapon, and we're going to have other ways to increase our reload speed, even if you do have to reload it manually. Now when it comes to the subclass, for the super, it doesn't really matter which one you use. Gathering Storm works amazing, because again, it jolts things, and so it procs your exotic, giving you a bit of extra damage resistance, so it works really well into that. But using Arc Staff is also very good. Both of them are going to work pretty fine, so go with whichever you want. Now for the abilities, you want to be on Gambler's Dodge. 100% you want to be on Gambler's Dodge, so you can get your melee back faster, so we can use our Tempest Strike just a lot more often. For your melee, it doesn't really matter which one you do. I just kept on Combination Blows, since it has a lower base cooldown, but we're never really going to use our regular melee, we're always going to use Tempest Strike. And lastly, for our grenade, I'm going to recommend the Flashbang Grenade. It is just the best grenade. It stuns champions, it blinds targets, and it's also going to apply a debuff, which kind of comes in handy when it comes to a couple of the mods that we're using in the artifact. Basically, just giving us even more Bolt Charge. Now moving on to the aspects, the very first one that we're going to start with, it has to be the newly buffed Ascension. Now, you can use 3 fragment slots instead of 2, and it also gives a very easy way of becoming amplified, giving us now damage resistance and reducing the accuracy of enemies against us. And lastly, but also very important, it's also going to be another way of jolting targets, meaning that it's another way of proccing our exotic armor and getting that damage resistance. You get even more damage resistance when you use your Ascension, because it gives you amplified, so you get the damage resistance from the amplified, and then you also get damage resistance from a chest piece. And on top of everything, it also does count to use the Bolt Charge. So whenever you have your Bolt Charge ready, if you use your Ascension, it will bring down that Lightning Strike. So you jolt them, and then the Lightning Strike hits them, and you essentially just instantly wipe any group of ads or do some very high damage to some of the bigger enemies. This fragment now does so many different things that I wouldn't be surprised if this becomes like the main go-to like arc fragment. All of the classes have like a go-to fragment that they always put on their builds, and it seems like Ascension, if it wasn't that already, it definitely is now. Now our second fragment is going to be Tempest Strike. This one just recently got a buff where it does a lot more damage against enemies in PvE, and that's all the enemies, majors, minors, bosses, just all around just does more damage. And that's without mentioning that everything that you hit with your Tempest Strike is also going to be jolted. And on top of that, now whenever you kill some jolted enemies, you also gain some Bolt Charge. And this can build up Bolt Charge very quickly. I actually ended up kind of using Bolt Charge with this build a lot more than I expected. I knew it was going to have some synergy with all the jolting that we were doing already, but it ended up being a lot more. You can actually just spam Bolt Charge with some of the fragments that we have on. It is awesome. Just constant lightning strikes all over the place. I just love it. And the synergy between these two fragments is just fantastic now that Ascension can give you back your melee by using near enemies, because it means that every time they use the Ascension, you essentially get back your melee. So the way that you want to use these two fragments in a fight is that you want to go in and use your Tempest Strike first, then you go and use your Ascension, which will give you your Tempest Strike so you can use it again, and then you'll probably be close to having another Ascension, which will just give you the Tempest Strike again. And you can kind of see what's happening here. We're basically just constantly jolting enemies, which is going to constantly making Ionic Traces, which is going to constantly buff up our Fusion Rifle, which is going to jolt things, which is going to make more Ionic Traces, and it just kind of goes like that over and over again. And every time you pick up Ionic Traces, we get some ability energy, so we can use our class ability, and also our melee even more. It is just a fantastic just cycle of jolting, bolt charging, spamming abilities, blinding enemies. This build is just beautiful. I am so happy with this build. I cannot stress that enough. Now moving on to the fragments, the first one we're going to have is the Spark Beacons, the GOAT of pretty much any arc build whenever we're amplified, which is going to be pretty much all the time. Our arc, special, or heavy final blows are going to create a blind explosion. So we're basically just going to perma-blind the enemies every time that we kill something next to them. Whether it's with our Fusion Rifle, which is the main thing that we're using, and this build also works really well with an arc machine gun. I would actually recommend the brand new one, the Watch Y, which I'm going to talk a little bit more in another video, but this thing is fantastic. It has some of the brand new arc perks like Rolling Storm, which works really good with this build. But even if you don't have some of these like arc specific perks, this is still just a really good machine gun to run with this build. But even if you're not running the machine gun, if you're running something more DPS specific, like a linear, it's, well, not really as useful, still something you can use. Enemies being blinded and not being able to hit you is never really a bad thing. Now the second mod is going to be the Spark of Resistance. We're always going to be surrounded, so we're going to be adding even more damage resistance on top of our exotic, and also the damage resistance we gain from being amplified. All of those together is going to give us that crazy damage resistance, so we can always stay alive in the middle of the fight without worrying of getting like melted by the enemies. After that, we're going to have the Spark of Ions, and this is another way that we're going to be making some Ionic Traces. Whenever we defeat some jolted targets, or targets with the Bolt Charge damage, is going to create Ionic Traces. So it's just another way of creating the Ionic Traces on top of the other ways that we already have. After that, we're going to have the Spark of Discharge, and this is a very important fragment, maybe one of the most important fragments to the build, because not only does it give us a way of creating Ionic Traces, but it also gives us a way of consistently gaining Bolt Charge over and over again, and it lets us spam it as much as we do. Because as we get some final blows with our arc weapons, we're going to get some Ionic Traces, and every time that we collect some of those Ionic Traces, we are also getting Bolt Charge. So whenever we're making like 3-4 Ionic Traces, every single time we're going to be getting 1 Bolt Charge from each of those Ionic Traces. At least that's what I would say if we didn't have this last fit fragment. Now this one's going to increase our stability and reload speed whenever we hit a melee, but most importantly is the second effect that was added to this fragment, which makes it so whenever we're amplified, we gain increased stacks of Bolt Charge from all sources. So instead of just getting 1 Bolt Charge per Ionic Trace, we get 2, making it much easier to fully charging up our Bolt Charge and being able to actually use it. So it only takes 5 Ionic Traces to to actually get that bolt charge going. And since we're also going to be getting them from getting some kills with our Tempest Strike, that's what really leads us to just being able to spam that thing over and over again. At first I was a little skeptical how good this mod was actually going to be, but it ended up being so good, and it really adds a lot more bolt charge to the build. I don't think we would be doing as many lightning strikes if we didn't have this mod on. Now moving on to the artifact, thankfully to get this build working you only have to get to like halfway through, and everything else after that is just gonna improve the build, but it's not technically necessary for the build. So the only things that you're gonna need is Unstoppable Fusion Rifle, and this is gonna be so you can take it into like any content with champions, and if you did decide to take a machine gun, then you definitely want Overload Machine Gun. Overcloak and Load is also gonna be really good, since wherever we are amplified we're gonna get increased handling and reload speed. Especially if you don't have the catalyst, you definitely want to have this, and if you have the machine gun, even better. If you take the machine gun, Hold the Line is also going to be really good, so you can get some reload speed and also healing on final blows. And then our main artifact perk, this is pretty much going to be a must-have for the build, is Dielectric. Defeating arc debuff targets gives us some bolt charge, so overall it's just going to build up our bolt charge a lot faster, and since we're going to be blinding a bunch of targets every time that we get a kill, this thing builds up really quickly. But surprisingly, this is actually not the most useful thing on this mod, because the boosted version is really what we're after. Rapidly defeating arc debuff targets spawns an overpower and also heals you a small amount. So this is gonna be constant healing, as well as helping all of the mods that we have that basically rely on overpower. This is essentially the mod that you want to buff. Nothing else is gonna be as good as this one when it comes to this build. This is just what you want. Just the extra health would be enough, but extra health and orbs just makes it perfect. For the 4th column, Dreadful Finisher would be good, so you can make some more special ammo, so you never run into any ammo issues. And also, Flashover would also be good. Flashover essentially is just going to make it so your lightning strikes from Bolt Shot do a bit more damage, and that's really it. And from the final column, Particle Reconstruction is what you want, as well as Defibrillating Blast. Now this only applies to champions. Whenever you stun a champion, you immediately get mad stacks of bolt charge, so you can immediately trigger it, and also stunning a champion will also heal you and jolt combatants around them. So overall, use some more healing to add more survivability to the build, while also doing some extra damage against champions. Just perfect, and these are the mods that you want to go for. It's probably gonna take me a couple days to get these mods, but I'm really looking forward to like seeing the whole build in action with every single mod. And lastly, let's take a look at the mods that were in this build. Now the mods didn't really change too much, except a couple of changes on the gauntlets. So starting here with the helmet, we have Harmonic Siphon, so we can make orbs with our arc weapons, and also Special Ammo Finder. Since we're mostly going to be using a special weapon, we definitely want to have as much ammo as possible. Now for the gauntlets, here we pretty much changed everything. Now we have Bolstering Detonation, Heavy Handed, and Focusing Strike. That means that whenever we do some damage with our melee, that includes our Tempest Strike, or with our grenade, we're going to be getting some energy on our class ability, so we can use our Ascension a lot more often. And whenever we get a kill with our Tempest Strike, we're also going to make Oversoul Power, which is also going to decrease the cooldown of our class ability. So all of these are used so we can spam our class ability a lot more often, since whenever our class ability is up more often, that also means our melee is up a lot more often. Now for the chest piece, nothing really changed. We still just have the resistances. Nothing really special there. But you could also go for reserves in this slot if you feel like maybe you don't have enough ammo, or you just want to have a bit more ammo to be more comfortable. Reserves can also work here pretty well. Now for the boots, we're going to have stacks and stacks so we can get some more armor charge whenever we pick up an overpower. Insulation, so we can get our class ability cooldown reduced whenever we pick up an overpower. And recuperation, so we can heal whenever we pick up overpower. Basically, again, just making sure that we always have a class ability. And lastly, for the class item, we have 2 utility kickstarts, and that's what we're going to be using all of our armor charge on, just to make sure that we can spam that class ability, baby, because that is just the biggest part of the build. We actually might be a little bit overkill with the regen on the class ability, so if you don't feel like you need this much, you could get rid of stacks and stacks. That would be like the main mod that I would get rid of for something like Absolution. So you can instead get a bit more for your other abilities. But with that, that's gonna be the end of the build. Like always, there's gonna be a dim link in the description below and also in the comments. That'll be down there as well. And the only thing that I gotta say is that I am very surprised with this build. I knew it was gonna be good, but it actually ended up exceeding my expectations with even more synergy than I thought it was gonna have. The amount of abilities we can get out there, the amount of jolt, the amount of bolt charge, just basically everything just constantly getting electrified and lightning strikes all over the place. It is beautiful. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the build, and I'm sure that you guys are going to be falling in love with this thing. Definitely going to be taking it to the GMs once those come out. It's going to be glorious. And yes, we are going to be revisiting the Warlock build now that the changes are out to see how that one's going to be holding up in this season as well. My expectations now are a little bit higher now that we saw how this ended up working out. So I'm hoping that one's going to be just as good as this one. Maybe even better, but we'll see. It's going to be really hard to top this one. Anyways, thank you for watching, thank you for stopping by, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.